We got to see
Is this
it.
better?
Perfect.
Okay,
Much better.
thanks for speaking up. So, all right. So moving forward here. All right. Social work licensing in Washington State. A brief overview of the history of licensure. Basically, licensure was created to protect the public. That is, social workers and other behavioral health professionals are working with vulnerable populations. And in order to protect the public, laws were passed state by state, ending in about 2005, 2006 for implementation, to protect the public from social workers that might do bad, but we wanted to have a regulatory authority at the state level so that way the laws had teeth to hold social workers accountable. So social workers that you might experience that have been licensed for a while may have had voluntary certification in the past, either through an association or through a state accrediting body. But beginning here in Washington State, um, laws were passed to enact licensing laws that have the force of law and teeth in the law to sanction social workers that aren't practicing up to professional standards. So the laws can be found. I wanted to launch with this chapter 18 225 revised code of Washington, or RCW, and then the rules are promulgated in 246 809 in the Washington Administrative Code, or WACS. Also worthy of note, especially during COVID, um, there are DOH, or Department of Health, policy statements that come out, and then also the governor's proclamations have force of law that affects social work practice. So moving forward, I just wanted you to be aware of that there's different sources of information that you can consult. I hope that you all get a chance to read chapter 18-225 RCW and WAC 246-809. But we'll go through some definitions. We'll defining the categories of social work licensure in Washington State, and then identify the steps to apply for social work licensure in Washington State, and then defining approved supervision and the steps that you need to take to get approved supervision from an approved supervisor. Lastly, we'll review continuing education requirements, and we'll share some resources for further reading and discussion. Okay, so the way that licensing is set up in Washington State is the Department of Health administers social work licensure in 4 separate categories. The licensed social worker associate in advance, that's the LSWAA, works towards the licensed advanced social worker, that is the LASW. The licensed social worker associate and independent clinical, or LSWAIC, is someone that is working towards, presumably, the licensed independent clinical social work designation. And we'll talk about the differences between each of the paths and what that means for you as a social work professional here in Washington State. Okay, so the source for licensing regulation in Washington State is, of course, the Revised Code of Washington. And in the definition section, it outlines what advanced social work actually is. It means the application of social work theory and methods, including emotional and biopsychosocial assessment, psychotherapy, under the supervision of a licensed independent clinical social worker or another mental health professional as defined in the rules and statute, case management, consultation, advocacy, counseling, or community organization. Again, advanced social work is always under the supervision of a licensed independent clinical social worker or another independent level behavioral health practitioner. That's important to note as we get into the roles of an LASW, a licensed advanced social worker, versus an LICSW, a licensed independent clinical social worker. Okay. According to the statute as well, independent clinical social work is defined, and it means the diagnosis and treatment of emotional and mental disorders based on knowledge of human development, the causation and treatment of psychopathology, psychotherapeutic treatment practices, and social work practice as defined in advanced social work. Treatment modalities include, but are not limited to, the diagnosis and treatment of individuals, couples, families, groups, or organization. So again, this is the independent level, independent clinical level of social work is defined. Looking at statute 2, the establishment clause basically outlines that LASWs and LICSWs are both able to exercise independent judgment and operate independently within their area of practice. So there are two different specializations. One way to think about it is somebody that works in macro social work, that is policy, administration, community practice, versus an LICSW who works in independent clinical social work. For the purposes of job classification, both are considered the top tier of licensure for the profession. So looking forward here, you have two different tiers. One tier is the associate level. The next tier would be the independent level. So associate level means a pre-licensure candidate. So someone that's working towards an LASW or an LICSW. They're working towards full licensure in their profession, has a graduate degree in a mental health field under RCW 18.225090, and is gaining the approved supervision, supervised experience, and continuing education needed to become a licensed independent clinical social worker and licensed advanced social worker, or, and then in the same statute, it's outlined mental health counselor or licensed marriage and family therapist. So associate licensure is the first step, actually second, in becoming licensed. So that's important to note that defined in law, you have to become an associate to become an independent level practitioner. So that said, in each state, almost every state has an associate level and an independent level. Here in Washington, you would need to complete a master's or doctoral social work educational program that is an MSW, DSW, or PhD in social work. And important to note, the program that you must graduate from would have to be accredited by the Council on Social Work Education, or CSWE. Those that have chosen University of Washington, for example, are made a good choice if you're looking to pursue licensure, because University of Washington is CSWE accredited. Most schools of social work, if they have social work in their name, will be accredited, but it is important for social work students and those wishing to be licensed uh, as a social worker to make sure their school is CSWE accredited. In the end of the presentation, I'll show you where to look that up if you're looking at a different graduate school than, say, University of Washington, God forbid. But if there is a program out of state that you're not sure of, you want to consider if they're under conditional accreditation by CSWE. That's kind of risky, but not necessarily guaranteed that you'd be able to get licensed later on as a social worker. So another requirement for all associate level licensees would be you need to complete an application from the Department of Health's website for social work licensure that is signed and dated. Application and initial licensure fee is sent to DOH, and there's different fees associated with the different levels of licensure, and I'll show you where to find those fee schedules that are always posted on DOH's website. You'd also have to, if you worked out of state, you'd have to complete an out-of-state verification form sent directly from each state, and then attest to 4 hours of HIV/AIDS education and training. So during normal times, that is the case. We're finding that there's been some waivers for different continuing education levels, which we can go into later, but you're lucky to be attending if you're attending the School of Social Work at University of Washington, they have a fantastic program that includes this. So lastly, the official transcripts of your MSW program would be sent directly to the Department of Health from the School of Social Work, or from the School of Social Work where your degree was obtained. It's important to note they have to be official transcripts, and things to think of when you're applying for licensure. If you have any difficulty getting the transcripts, that is, If you have, some schools have a registrar's department that will withhold transcripts if something's not paid for. Make sure you're not in arrears with the school. That is, that you don't owe them money besides financial aid. So I'll tell you horror stories about that at some point. Okay, so the licensed associate then begins accruing the necessary hours. Remember, we talked about work experience that's needed, of supervised employment, that is from somebody that has approved supervision credentials, and continuing education necessary to apply for full licensure within the maximum 7-year period. So once you're awarded the LSWAA or LSWAIC, you have uh, up to 7 years to get the approved supervision hours that you need to move on to the LICSW or the LASW. So associate licenses are valid for 1 year, have to be renewed every year on the date of issuance, and can be renewed no more than 6 times. So total is 7 years. This allows you enough time, presumably. So you would always want to make sure that you renew, even if you haven't gained the hours that you were hoping to gain in the first few years of licensure. Don't ever let your associate credential lapse, because they need to have to start over. So be very careful about that. There are some holds that you can place, but I would advise that usually licensee applicants at the associate level, don't let it lapse. Odd tip. Next, for the licensed advanced social worker, the employment requirements is 3,200 hours of employment with 800 in direct client contact. And direct client contact is not defined in statute. It is defined by the social work profession. So that means working directly with clients in a social work capacity. You'll talk about it in your programs. It's a term of art for schools of social work in the professional sphere. The Department of Health has previously advised that for purposes of documenting direct client contact in advanced social work, clients can be at the micro, that is face-to-face, meso, groups and families, et cetera, and organizations, and macro levels working in policy. Approved clinical supervision, you need 90 hours for the LASW, 50 of which must be from an independent level social worker. Continuing education, you need 36 hours and 6 in law and ethics. And the 6 hours in law and ethics, the statute defers to the unprofessional conduct statute. So you'd want to make sure to look that up to make sure, if it's not explicit that this course, that continuing education course, qualifies for law and ethics, you'd want to look at that statute and make sure that it aligns with what unprofessional conduct and how to avoid unprofessional conduct is outlined. For the licensed independent clinical social worker, the work requirements are 4,000 hours, 1,000 hours in direct client services, and under the supervision of an LICSW. An approved clinical supervision, you'd need 130 hours, 70 of which would need to be provided by an LICSW, and 60, the remaining hours after that slash, that would be from other mental health professionals at the independent level. Continuing education, you need 36 hours, again, 6 hours in law and ethics. And when we say 36 hours, it's 36 contact hours. So that's content delivery. When you go to a conference or something, if the conference is 8 hours long, for example, be careful not to include all those hours if there's some ceremonial stuff or a luncheon or buffet and non-content delivery time. Contact hours are one clock hour of content delivery, educational content delivery, and not the entire day, for example. There are exam requirements for LASWs and LICSWs. So a passing score, the administrator of the proctor of the exams, I guess, would be the Association of Social Work Boards. That's the ASWB, and they're a great resource. They create advanced generalist examination for those looking to practice in non-clinical roles. And then they have an LIC, or the clinical exam, which is strictly for those wishing to work in clinical arenas. You need a passing score, and in statute, it doesn't outline what the passing score is. It depends on the question set. So we've been told between 70 and 75%. I would aim for 75% passing score on the ASWB clinical or generalist exam. One tip is that if you know that you have challenges with taking exams, there are strategies, there are workshops that you can attend to prepare for license preparation. We do offer those through NASW. Other organizations also offer that. And so it's a way to remain competitive and to actually pass the exam. So I would strongly recommend that. So again, the flow or chain of events, the path towards licensure would be: one, make sure you went to a CSWE accredited school and a master's or doctorate social work program, PhD or DSW or MSW program. The Department of Health application, you'd want to turn in for one of the two associate credentials, that is the LSWAA, licensed associate advanced, or the AIC, the LSW AIC, the independent level one. So you'd want to pick out which one you're going to go for and roll with it. So LSW AIC becomes an LICSW, and LSWAA, your ultimate goal is the LASW. Next, you'd want to accrue the minimum hours of supervised employment, approved supervision, and continuing education over a period of not fewer than 3 and no more than 7 years. That's what's needed to apply for full licensure. The Department of Health application for full licensure, you need to make sure that's filled out completely and turned into the Department of Health. They do have an online application. There are pen and ink signatures required, however, for the supervised employment that you will need to make sure to provide the original copies. Also, the transcripts that you get from your school, those have to be directly from the school, an official copy of the transcripts, not a copy or unofficial copy of the transcripts. Lastly, passing the ASWB examination grants you full licensure. So then you get a certificate in the mail. Don't lose it. Make sure you hang on to it. That's what you can frame and put in your office behind you when you're doing telehealth in the future, or hopefully not in the future, maybe seeing people face to face. And that is what, when social workers are registered with the Department of Health and licensed with the Department of Health, folks can then look you up as a provider to make sure that you're don't have any pending complaints against you through the Department of Health. They can make sure that your license is current, for example. So speaking of which, there are continuing education requirements for clinical supervisors. So approved supervisors would need to have a certain amount of continuing education in order to be qualified as a supervisor for social work licensure. Per the Washington Administrative Code, prior to the commencement of any supervision, the supervisor needs to provide the licensed candidate a declaration stating that they've met the requirements of the administrative code and that you qualify as an approved supervisor. I'll show you where those forms are at the end of the presentation, so that way you can reference those. The Department of Health doesn't keep a roster of approved clinical supervisors. We have an unofficial roster at NASW of people that want to advertise that they're taking supervisees, for example. But just note that the clinical supervisor is attesting that they've met the requirements. So an attestation basically means you're swearing that you've gotten the requirements, including 15 hours of clinical supervision, continuing education. So this is language from the form. It says, I've completed the following: a minimum of 15 clock hours of training and clinical supervision obtained through a supervision course, continuing education credits on supervision, supervision of supervision, or any combination of these. In Washington State, usually you'll see continuing education workshops are offered, 15 hours of clinical supervision. If somebody takes a clinical supervision course in another state, they can then look at documenting supervision of people being supervised and make sure that it's documented. So this is what your supervisor, the hoops that they have to jump through to make sure they're qualified to supervise you as a supervisee. It also attests that 25 hours of experience in supervision of clinical practice and that they have 2 years of clinical experience post-license. So hopefully that would be enough to provide you the confidence that somebody is able, one, to supervise you, but this is a lot of work that they have to do post-licensure to make sure that they've applied their knowledge, skills, and abilities to the appropriate therapeutic settings, for example. The third part of the declaration form is I attest I will gain a thorough knowledge of the supervisee's practice activities, including practice setting, record keeping, which is really important. So make sure to always look up record keeping because there's specific record keeping for folks that are in behavioral health, financial management, ethics of clinical practice, and a backup plan for coverage. That is, that they have somebody in their pocket that they're going to come and supervise you and has also signed a declaration form to do the supervision. So this form is to be completed by the supervisor and provided to you as a candidate as an LSWAA or AIC prior to the commencement of any supervision. So this is a good thing to ask about when you're seeking employment, especially in areas that if you're working in a behavioral health agency, for example, there's agency affiliated counselors, but some might have LICSWs that might be willing to provide that clinical supervision. If you work for another behavioral health agency or private practice, make sure that they provide clinical supervision. Otherwise, you would, if you were pursuing independent licensure or the advanced social work licensure, you need to go outside of your employment setting to seek that clinical supervision that's needed for the areas of practice. Okay, a note on continuing education. Each state varies in the amount of clock hours that they need for continuing education. Washington law requires all licensed social workers and marriage and family therapists and counselors to receive and document continuing education. 18 hours per year is the minimum for associates to have in order to renew each year. So this is before you become an LICSW while you're an LSWAIC or an LSWAA pursuing an LASW. So every other year, you need 6 hours in professional law and ethics is required. Associates also must have received these hours after completing the academic requirements and prior to the department issuing their full license. Except the CE courses that are accepted are outlined in statute and in the administrative code. That does include distance learning, seminars, workshops, and postgraduate institutes. So that also means education through the School of Social Work if you want to take a class one-off, if you're allowed to do that. Folks will often go back for ethics, for example, if it's offered through the Schools of Social Work. Just a quick note here too, distance learning, there are limits on the amount of hours for distance learning, that is online continuing education. When the statutes were written, of course, Zoom and that sort of thing didn't exist. So there was a limitation placed on, one, the amount of hours that could be pursued for continuing education. It was limited to, I believe, 26. So now that's been waived during COVID by the Department of Health until the public health emergency is over. And that's through prosecutorial discretion on their part. Another quick note, distance supervision. There's a restriction on the amount of distance supervision, that is clinical supervision that you get in non-face-to-face using telephonic or video means. That has been waived during the public health emergency as well. It was limited to, I believe it was 60 hours. And right now, the association is supporting legislation in the Washington legislature to lift that restriction. It's only for the social work profession, which is interesting. So for those folks that want to track that bill that here in 2021, that's House Bill 1007. So fun fact. All right, what else we got here? All right, so it also required in every 6 years, all licensed social workers, including associates, need to complete a DOH-approved training in suicide assessment, treatment, and management. That's really important to note because suicidality is nationwide has been a huge problem. We have a researcher, of course, at University of Washington that helped kind of point that out to the behavioral health profession. And now it's in statute here in Washington state, which I think is really a very pertinent requirement for social workers practicing here. Recent social work graduates can delay the completion of their first training required for 6 years if you've taken an approved course no more than 6 years prior to application for initial licensure. And University of Washington does offer that courses to meet that requirement. So I don't know if I went too fast because I'm not keeping track of time, but Hiro, can you give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if I'm on track? Thumbs up? Okay. So I'm getting towards the end here. The resources that we have here in Washington State through the Department of Health, there is a licensing page that includes a lot of things on the side tab. When we go to that page, I'll show you. Basically, it outlines the rules and laws for social work licensure. It also includes frequently asked questions. So those things that you might come up with, consult the frequently asked questions list. One of the frequently asked questions was, can I obtain my hours without becoming an LSWAA or AIC? No, they're pretty much have made it very impossible to move forward without declaring that you're collecting the hours. The second website that I want to show you is Association of Social Work Boards. The ASWB was created as a clearinghouse for all the social work boards across the country. They have resources including a comparative list of laws and rules state by state, and two, they have a registry that you can register in to track your supervision hours. And I think they're able to send that to the licensing boards as you move across the country. So not everyone here in Washington is going to stay here forever. So this is a helpful resource for you if you decide to move. Next is NASW Washington State Chapter. We're developing license prep courses and other continuing education resources, in addition to networking and advocacy information for social workers specific to Washington State. And then lastly, NASW, the National Association of Social Workers, has developed a lot of resources, including standards of practice for working in healthcare settings, child welfare, et cetera. But they also have resources during the pandemic showing the comparative statutes state by state about telehealth, for example. Each state has different laws and rules related to who you can see and what you can do. If your client moves from Washington to Oregon, for example, or Oregon to Washington, it's very explicit on what situations you can still see them remotely. So that said, let me see where I'm at here. Again, disclaimers, this is informational only. I'm not an attorney. This is not legal advice. So I encourage you to make sure to check the DOH website and also the laws and rules on the state legislature's website. Lastly, I really want to stress the Department of Health is the authority on all things licensing in Washington State. The National Association of Social Workers is a membership-based professional association. We're a 501c6. We are not a regulatory authority. So that said, be happy to answer any questions before I jump into showing websites and things like that. I did also want to acknowledge that one of your professional colleagues, Jonathan Beard, helped provide a lot of background and support for me and my team developing the slideshow. And also I have a handout that I don't think made it to Michelle, but I will make sure that everyone gets it. It was created by one of our membership engagement committee members, Serene Miller, out of Spokane. So we'll hopefully be able to follow up and post that as well. So, and does that mean 58 people are here, not 58 questions?
We actually have more than 58 people here tonight. And it looks like there have been a few questions here in the chat. I've caught a few, and if Aaron or other colleagues have found others, speak up here. But someone was wondering about the importance of attending a CSWE accredited PhD program. Are they okay if they attended an MSW program that was accredited and then pursued other education?
That should be fine. Absolutely. The MSW is a terminal degree in social work. So the PhD, of course, is like, you know, a super desirable educational credential. And it's kind of like, I guess the way I look at it is one, the BSW provides generalist education, MSW is specialist education, and PhD is super specialist education. So making sure that your MSW program was CSWE accredited is ultimately the most important thing.
Thank you. Maybe I will pose the next question. And if folks have follow-up questions as Mr. Arp shares responses, feel free to put those in the chat as well. I think this was related to supervision, and someone was wondering, can chunks of time less than an hour count, like a half an hour, a quarter of an hour? How are those kind of calculated?
That's a great question. I think I will have to defer to, I can get the answer to that question, but I think it was usually in half-hour chunks. By state, it's different by state. In Arizona, it was by quarter hour. So I would probably say take the person's email, and maybe I can get back to them about, because we know that supervision is not going to occur, you know, hour by hour, for example, on the hour, but I can find out and get back to you.
And someone was wondering if it's possible or if it might make sense to pursue both social work licenses simultaneously, I believe.
That's a great question. I don't think you can currently. I think that you can accrue the hours. As far as in Washington State, you have two credentials that are different, like the SUDP, for example, the substance use credential, and the LICSW would complement each other. For example, the LASW, I will say the licensed advanced social worker, only a couple of hundred people actually have the LASW. So I would almost, if I were to pursue licensure in Washington State, in my job capacity, for example, I do no clinical work and no behavioral health. I would likely go for the LASW. If you're remotely thinking about working in behavioral health, or ever want to hang up a shingle to be a clinical supervisor, or have your own practice, go for the LICSW.
And I'm going to ask a piggyback question there. What if your goals change midstream? So you've been accruing hours towards one of those licenses, and then you decide you want a different future. Can you switch the path that you're on and retain the hours that you've already acquired?
I think that you'd then have to make sure that the hours that you're accruing would meet the definition of the clinical social work. That is, Those hours are a bit different, but make sure that you're doing clinical work to apply for the LICSW, for example. Again, we're seeing the proportion of people that have secured the LASW is relatively low to the amount of people that have the LICSW. And I just pulled stats, but I don't want to mess with this window, so I can send you that as well, what the current breakdown of LASW versus LICSW. And yes, you can get a copy of the PowerPoint.
Thank you.
Then another person asked, you touched on this a little bit, but perhaps you could elaborate a bit. The concern is sort of how you can find a workplace that will be able to provide supervision. And if you sort of start that clock, but aren't able to find a workplace where you get a supervisor that's appropriate, if you have any tips about strategies for how to handle that?
Well, you have 7 years to do the associate level licensing, that is the first year, and then the 6 renewal periods. One strategy that folks have used is, one, finding clinical experience outside of their workplace where they can get clinical supervision, either free or paid. So this is where it's a little dicey, because you can contract with a clinical supervisor or supervisor outside of your workplace to give you supervision on hours outside of that workplace. In smaller agencies and private practices, usually will offer clinical supervision as kind of a incentive to work there, and it also gives them a labor pool too. So it's usually mutually beneficial. The limitation to our discussion tonight is, one, there's the agency affiliated credentials, agency affiliated counselors, for example, in state agencies and behavioral health agencies. For example, Green Hill School employs AACs. They would have to go for an LSWAIC credential in addition to their AAC. That's a whole different statute and a whole different set of rules for that, but you would still want to make sure that you had an LICSW on staff that would be comfortable providing that clinical supervision. And so it's, so there's a couple of strategies there. One, there's a lot of clinical supervisors that will hang up a shingle and say, hey, I'm looking for supervisees. That would be a perfect opportunity. Again, you have you have just 7 years to get those hours, the 4,000 hours, for example. So.
Well, and one of our brave participants here is wondering, if they go straight through full-time, how long does it take to get to licensing? So if you're assuming that you're accruing hours in a full-time job.
A minimum of 3 years is the bottom end, and a maximum of 7 years. So I would think that 3 years would be kind of the fastest to accrue the hours, because we're approximately 2,000 hours a year of work, right, for a full-time position. You wouldn't want to go any more than that. So, but the supervised work experience that generally that you're looking for, you want to make sure it's a quality setting. You want to make sure that you get a quality supervisor and that you keep your documentation.
Thank you.
Next question was back to thinking about the possibility for remote continuing education and/or remote supervision. What if someone works in a rural setting where it's difficult to access that?
Okay, so that's one of the reasons why House Bill 1007 is moving forward. Is one, the argument is that distance supervision and finding a clinical supervisor that's willing to provide it face to face is hard to get during COVID, but also in rural and remote areas. And so when you have a workforce that is sparse, say in some of the northern counties or eastern counties, It is difficult. The other thing that we're exploring is telephonic supervision versus video only supervision, or video and audio supervision. That's something that's being explored too. With continuing education, the restrictions are in place, or not in place during COVID, during the public health emergency. But moving forward, it would be something that we'd like to explore as a chapter, to lobby the state legislature to make it all remote, since we know it works now, right? I think everybody might be zoomed out at this point in the day, but we know that it works. We know that it's effective. When the statute was passed, we didn't have this kind of access to technology. So good question. We'll continue to work on it.
And the next question was asking if you could clarify a little bit more about the difference between the LASW and the LICSW, especially the differences in kind of careers and what they're geared for.
Sure thing. So an LICSW is a licensed independent level clinical social worker. So that would be somebody that's hoping to work as a clinician, somebody wanting to supervise clinicians in an agency, or working in a behavioral health capacity. And LASW is the independent credential for those folks working in more of an administrative managerial capacity, without necessarily face-to-face client contact. An LASW can practice face-to-face client contact, but only under supervision of an LICSW. So more kind of like the macro track of social work, that's kind of what it's aimed at, the LASW. Each state is very different. So some states will have, for example, Arizona, since I know it, the LMSW is considered a license for those folks that are pursuing the LCSW, that's the independent level. But the LMSW, if you're not a clinician, would be the terminal one for somebody working, say, in public policy, if they wanted to have an LMSW. It's not necessary in all states. Arizona's scope of practice is limited to behavioral health. Washington's is a little bit wider, but it is in the Department of Health statutes for behavioral health professions. So it depends on what arena you want to work in.
Thank you.
That's helpful information. Thank you. We have a couple more questions, and then I think perhaps we'll maybe move to breakout rooms. And of course, there will still be opportunities to get questions answered and before 8 o'clock. But our next question is, can you get licensed while working for the Department of Children, Youth, and Families? And is the process different?
So again, with the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, depending on what section you you work in, would be, it depends. If you have a clinical supervisor, that somebody that's qualified as a clinical supervisor to provide you that supervision, that would be appropriate. If you're working in a behavioral health capacity, if you're not working in a behavioral health capacity, that would be something to talk about with them, because my thought is that they likely have an agency affiliated credential and not the independent level credential. So that's under a whole different statute and a whole different sectional of administrative code. So that might be another presentation that we can give about people working in agencies, for example. So I don't think I answered your question, but possibly, I guess, would be the answer.
And I think you just volunteered to come back. In the meantime, someone else is wondering about for the direct supervision hours for the LICSW, realizing that some of those need to be under the supervision of an LICSW, but what other credentials work for supervision hours?
That would be on this slide over here. It would be a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a nurse practitioner, psychiatric nurse practitioner, and let me get back to the slide here. There's a whole list in statute and in rule. So let me go back to it. I don't have two screens, so bear with me here. So usually it's psychologist and psychiatrist that people use. You'd think that I'd have a paper copy next to me, but I don't. Okay, it's the one, yeah. So specifically mentioned is psychiatrist, psychologist, psychiatric advanced registered nurse practitioner, psychiatric nurse, or other mental health professionals as may be defined by rules adopted by the secretary. So, for example, you couldn't receive hours from somebody that just had a SUDP, for example. So,
all right. Our next question is whether hours in practicum during the BASW or MSW count. Are those?
no. So the hours that count would be for the continuing education requirement for suicidality, for example. That's, I think, the exception. Usually you have to, in any state, usually your hours accrue after you get the the go ahead, the associate level application in the licensing. That's when you start accruing your hours, not before. Usually. So each state is a bit different. Just note that each state's rules and laws change very regularly. And NASW and other associations are looking at making sure that licenses are portable. That is, the licensing requirements. We don't want to have a race to the bottom, that is, have it be 2,000 hours and not 4,000 hours. But I can tell you some states require 3,200 hours for both levels of licensure, or 2,800 hours. And some states are easier to get licensed in than others. So that's something to consider. So if you get licensed in Arizona, let's say, and you try to move here, there might be some discrepancies, that is, in the hours of clinical supervision that you received. But the Department of Health is working on what's called reciprocity implementation. In statute, it was passed that they would look at that to see what was substantially equivalent. And so it's becoming easier to move to Washington State. It's still a bit messy if you're licensed on the East Coast and move here, or if you're licensed at the independent level but weren't doing clinical social work, you can't just come in and do the LICSW.
So much to think about. The next question in the chat is acknowledging that in looking in places like Indeed and other websites, it seems like most jobs posted are asking for an LICSW as part of employment. And so the question is, are you finding that to be a barrier for people finding work after the MSW, but before licensing? Do you have a feel for that at all?
So I know that there's a massive behavioral health workforce shortage in Washington State and a lot of other Western states. So that people are always looking for the independent level practitioner, because you get two things with that. One, you get somebody that could potentially be a clinical supervisor, and two, you get somebody that can bill at the independent level, independent rate. And so that I would look for jobs that are looking for that offer clinical supervision, one, but pursuing that independent level credential then makes you more marketable, for sure. So I do see a lot of jobs in Washington State that one, the LICSW is very desirable. So getting that as soon as you can is one strategy to make sure that you're in demand for.
Next question, next person is wondering, can the clinical supervision hours be included in the employment hours for the LICSW?
So the total hours, it includes the 800, I believe, so, or the 1,000, I believe. So let me check here. It's different for every state. So going back to that slide, employment 4,000 hours, with 1,000 in direct client services and under supervision or clinical supervision of an LICSW.
And then that 130 hours is separate. You don't get to count your 130 hours of supervision in your
I
4,000.
believe, I believe that would be under the 4,000 hours, but I
Okay.
can double check that. My understanding is that it would be 4,000 hours total with 1,000 in direct client services. Let me double check that because I believe it is included in the 4,000.
Okay, thank you.
That's my recollection as well. Let's see. It looks like there's a follow-up question around reciprocity again. So if you have any words of wisdom around the ease with which you can become licensed here and then move to another state. So I know you were talking about the ease of people moving into Washington if they've been licensed elsewhere, but how about the reverse?
Well, Washington has the higher standard, so I guess it's easier to move from Washington to another state. Usually, people moving to Washington, they're the ones that are experiencing the barriers because you require 4,000 hours at the very bottom. It's you know, if you're coming from Arizona or another state with like say 3,200 hours for the clinical license versus the in some states, I think it was New Hampshire, was 2,800 hours total for the clinical license. That becomes a barrier because it's not substantially equivalent. So the Department of Health website will kind of help for people moving to Washington, moving out of Washington. Generally, it should work out in your favor because the standards are much higher here. So one other place to look, ASWB and NASW and CSWE are part of a group that created a website called Moving Social Work. And Moving Social Work is looking at creating more statutes and laws related to reciprocity and license portability between states. What we don't have in social work is a compact system, like the psychologists have compacts between the states. What we didn't set up in the beginning of social work licensure was something like the state bar for attorneys, where there's portability between different states, I guess, except for Louisiana. And so it's one of those things that in hindsight, I wish we all as states got on the same page, but the crux of it is one jurisdiction is not going to defer total authority for licensing to another jurisdiction. And so that's why we're looking at things like reciprocity in practice rather than in statute, to look at things that are substantially equivalent. Still, you have to do an application. Still, the Washington Department of Health has to give you the thumbs up or thumbs down or tell you to get more work experience. So hope that answered your question. I just know that that is a hot button issue right now, and especially during telehealth, where each state pays a different wage, more or less, for social work practice and psychotherapy. Just a quick note on telehealth. Usually with telehealth and with seeing clients, your where the client resides determines what state you need to be licensed in. So if you have a client that moves to California, moves there permanently, likely telehealth is not permitted. If they're just visiting, maybe. It depends on where the client is at. So that has changed under COVID too, because if you're doing volunteer work in an emergency management situation, there are exceptions to that and applications you fill out with the Department of Health. But depending on how long the pandemic goes, this might be an issue going forward, because if we lift those restrictions, what's to say that the labor market that doesn't pay anything, they would just use clinicians in that state, and then insurance companies would be happy. The social work profession would see their wages go down, so that's no good.
I think this might be our last question before we break out into rooms. It's kind of a related question and back, I think, to the distinction between the two types of licenses. If folks are still wondering, does it ever make sense to have both, or is one kind of license more of an umbrella over the other? And which one helps you get a job more?
I would say that just off the cuff, I would say based on the number of licensees in each category, again, there's only a few hundred LASWs in Washington state, and the majority of licensees are LICSWs. That would be one thing. Also, LICSWs can do the clinical supervision and of people working in behavioral health. Knowing that there's a shortage, there will always be jobs available for LICSWs that are competent practitioners. So am I telling you to do an LICSW? It depends. So an LASW is also valuable. It's just a different career track. But again, in statute, the intent was not to license every social worker in the state of Washington. It provides for the behavioral health context, whether you're in leadership or working in the micro and meso levels, is another thing to consider. Also, depending on the track in school, if you went to school for planning, administration, community practice, and policy, then LASW might be more appropriate. If you went to school as an advanced generalist or as a direct practice track, the LICSW is what you're training for. So that's something to consider as well.
And I got one more question sent just to me. It kind of parallels the different types of populations and institutions. So are there any considerations with regard to working with the military for how to access jobs and licensing and what makes sense with military populations?
So it depends. So if you work for the Veterans Administration, for example, and federal employers, it depends on the employer. The license, if you're licensed in another state, usually the Veterans Administration will defer to the license in that state. For spouses of folks that are in a military home with a spouse in the military and they're having to transfer all over the country, there are exceptions in statute for that situation. I'm not sure what it is in Washington state. I do know that there's carve-outs in, say, Arizona and maybe Idaho for that. I'd have to go back and check for Washington state. But that is a great question since there's a couple of military installations here.
It is. That's a very good question. Well, I think we've added to your homework for your next visit. I also think we've exhausted the questions in chat at this point. So our plan was to open some breakout rooms, and we will have one for current students and one for prospective students. And you're welcome to stay in this main room here and continue conversation. But if you see a little thing pop up, those are your options, and we invite you to carry on conversation about this or to connect and talk about what's on your mind.